the time to speak to us and visit us. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
So we are in Toronto. We're an all-boys school, and you're speaking to a group of guys from the film club. So we do offer multimedia courses, digital media and such at the school, and students are producing films and other artifacts. But for the film club, we really are speaking to the students who have, an outside of the curriculum interest in movie making and reading media and all those great things. So.
Excellent.
Yeah, it's really great for you to take the time to do this with all the success that you're having with the film. So maybe we could begin with that. So the guys have watched, they've watched the documentary. A couple of guys have some questions about it. But maybe we can begin. You're an independent filmmaker, so can you educate these guys, these 16, 17-year-olds, what an independent filmmaker is?
Yeah, sure. So I guess the hard part is that there's not necessarily a ton of money in independent filmmaking. So that's sort of the first thing to know. If you want to make a film, certainly follow your passions. It's essentially what I did with Back in Time. But at the same time, it's not necessarily going to put food on the table. So it's good to do it while you're young and you got parents supporting you. So essentially what that means is on the day-to-day, we have a production company here in New York, and we work for a lot of corporate clients, and we do a lot of event coverage type stuff along with production pieces. So for example, Ray-Ban, Oakley, these are some of our clients. We work for Showtime, we cover boxing for them. So every day is a little bit different, which is nice. And then that sort of drives the business, and then it allows us to do our own projects on the side, independent projects like Back in Time.
So first, guys, does anyone have a question about that? So in the Canadian marketplace, I've told a lot of these guys, for example, my first career before teaching was independent production. And in Canada, it's very, very difficult to make any type of living whatsoever in a publicly funded system. So I was explaining to these guys where an average Hollywood film will spend $100 million in marketing. Our films are $5 million inclusive of marketing. So it's very, very difficult. But with that said, your passion projects, why back to, why I saw you had a Kickstarter fund for it, correct? You were raising money, right?
Yeah.
So why that journey? Why that journey into telling a story about the making of Back to the Future?
Well, here's the interesting chicken and egg situation that happened with Back in Time. When I had the idea and I love Back to the Future, I've always loved Back to the Future since I'm a kid. When I had the idea to make Back in Time, I think the big question was, do people want to see this? And in an attempt to answer that question, my executive producer, Lewis, and I decided that we should kickstart this because if the world wants to see it, and if other people are going to find it interesting, then we think that they'll donate to this Kickstarter. So the Kickstarter was almost the proof of concept. It was the answer to whether or not we had a good idea in our hands. And that was sort of the driver that gave us the idea that, okay, people are interested in Back to the Future. It's not just me. It's not just this crazy idea. And if they're going to support it, then on a small scale, the Kickstarter was certainly the small scale. Our first Kickstarter, we had 600 backers. Then we assumed on a larger scale, when this thing's available for a couple dollars or it's on Netflix to watch for free, people will be interested in the content. So that first Kickstarter allowed us to do it. And I think going back to the last question, the reality is that, again, when nobody is throwing money your way to make a film like this, having platforms like Kickstarter are amazing because it allowed us to go to the outside world to raise, originally it was $45,000 to go ahead and start making this thing. Eventually it kind of snowballed completely out of control and we ended up with the entire cast and it meant a lot of travel on our part and that was predominantly what cost the most money in this thing and then we had to do a second Kickstarter to raise money for post-production and came up with another $150,000, which by the way, we spent all of, and then some. What was a project started shooting on our own cameras and driving a car up to Massachusetts turned essentially into almost a $250,000, film project.
Well, well, you can tell it's incredibly well done. And there was one of the students here had questions about what was one of your questions? Yeah. Come on. Introduce yourself.
Hi.
Hey.
So my question is, obviously there must have been a lot of planning stages think about what you wanted to include in the film, what you didn't want to include. So what was your thought process behind including things like your interviews, your scripting, your questions, and even your thought of including the fans and how Back to the Future affected them?
So the reality of it is this documentary was all about the fans. It started with the fans, Bill Shea and Patrick Shea, the father and son from Massachusetts, who have the incredible Back to the Future collection. They were the focal point of this entire documentary. I mean, when I heard their story and the story of the Hollers, you know, a couple that drives around together in this DeLorean and raises money for Michael J. Fox Foundation, those two stories are what drove me to do this. There was never a thought that we would have Michael J. Fox or Steven Spielberg. That wasn't in the planning. So this was really always about the fans. What happened was, over time, as the documentary grew interest and we were able to get more cast and crew, we sort of ended up in a position where it was like, wait a minute, we have all this stuff now, what do we do? So a lot of documentaries, you'll look in the credits and you'll see writer as a credit. And it's always like, wait a minute, a writer on a documentary, how does that work? And the reality is a lot of documentaries are written beforehand. There's a whole narrative written, this is where we want to start, this is where we want to go, this is who we're going to interview. And we didn't have that luxury in the sense that once we were crowdfunded in 2013, we just started shooting. And anytime we heard of a great Back to the Future story, something that I said, yeah, this has got to be in, we would shoot it. There was an entire shoot that we did in 2013 that's not even in the documentary. I mean, we spent a ton of money. We went out to Vegas, full crew. We shot 8 interviews, and none of it's in the film. It's actually in the bonus features. We felt bad leaving it out, so we made a bonus feature out of it, and that's just because it didn't fit the narrative anymore. It was a very long process, and then we ended up 2 years later, and it's, wow, we have 50 hours of footage. And the problem is, and I shouldn't read reviews, but I do, you read what some people say about the film, and one of the negatives is, well, I've seen the Back to the Future making of documentary on the Blu-ray 5 years ago. This was nothing new in that department. And we knew that. We knew that the set stories, they've been told. The movie was made 30 years ago. Of course, Michael J. Fox has been interviewed a countless number of times, and we didn't think that we were going to bring anything new in that department, but at the same time, we wanted this to appeal to somebody that might have just seen Back to the Future once. So they didn't know that Michael J. Fox wasn't the original Marty, and they didn't know where the story came from Bob Gale. So that first 35 minutes of the film, where it's all cast and crew and how this thing got done, we viewed that as a necessary evil. But if that was the whole documentary, we would have just been essentially remaking stuff that's been done. So that's the idea. The core of this was always about the fans, and that's what it was planned on being. The individual stories, I mean, we didn't know. There were stories I found out during the second Kickstarter. So literally a year and a half into production, I'd get an email. Marco Pasqua, who lives up in Canada, you guys, is over in Vancouver, I guess other end of the country, and he became a senior associate producer during the second Kickstarter. Sent me an email, said I love Back to the Future. It's changed my life. I have cerebral palsy, and he was emailing me not because he wanted to be in a documentary because he thought his story was anything special, but he wanted to tell me how his life was affected by Back to the Future, and that's why he wanted to contribute financially to our film. I read between all those lines and just saw, oh my God, this story is incredible. This guy has to be in our film, and fortunately, and this is again where having corporate clients comes into play. We had a corporate shoot in Vancouver, went in a day early and shot with Marco, rather than having to, spend money on international travel and all that. We just let one of our clients pay for it, which was great, and we did that a fair number of times in LA as well.
That's it's funny that you say it. You make mention of the negative reviews. I wanted to see the film for quite a while, and then I was telling the boys about it. But unfortunately, there was not a screening in the Toronto area. And then I happened to be at the gym on the elliptical of all things, and boom, on Netflix it came up, and I was, it was amazing. I got through it all in one shot, really. But I was impressed with the fact that you got the Spielbergs, and I want to ask how that even happened. But I was more amazed by the mini golf, the gentleman who had the mini golf in his backyard, and hearing about all those fans. Seeing Mayor Goalie Wilson and all these kind of secondary characters and seeing how their life unfolded. There's one student, Justin. You had a question about the second half, right? Bring it over here.
Of the individual fan stories that you shot, what was your favorite one?
Oh, that's an interesting one. I think the Holler story is absolutely my favorite in terms of just looking at how how deep it goes, how deep Back to the Future fandom runs, and that you have this couple, and one day you guys will get married, and the concept of sitting in a car with your wife driving 400,000 miles, I mean, it's foreign. So that was the most impressive. But at the same time, I've developed so many friendships and relationships with the people in the film. Adam Contras, who has the golf course, he happens to be a friend. I talk to him almost every day. So
Amazing.
It's great what's sort of come out of this, that these kind of relationships going forward.
Do you have any? Maybe just a couple more questions. I don't want to take up too much of your time. So why we had Back to the Future, day. There's a lot of buzz around the world happening, especially online, social media, and such. You're a filmmaker. Why the longevity of the series? I know you cover it in your film, but why are people like myself who are watched Back to the Future when I was 5 years old? Now I'm teaching it in my classes. Why do we even still care about Marty?
Listen, there's no question about it. Bob Gale and Robert Zemeckis, they wrote the perfect screenplay. This story, you never see that, and ironically, if you ask them about it, would Back to the Future work today if it was released in 2015? And they say no, it wouldn't. Movies just aren't like that anymore, where there's so much setup and so much exposition that then pays off later. But for me as a kid, and I grew up, as a kid with Back to the Future, it always seemed real. I know it's crazy because essentially you categorize it under science fiction, but this was stuff that as you watched it, it's like, yeah, I wonder who owns the time machine. And especially Back to the Future 2, I'm a huge technology guy. You watch Back to the Future 2 and you think like Sports Almanac. It was written so plausibly that everything in the film could possibly be real, and that's because of the simple plot line. And this didn't take place in a galaxy far, far away. It took place in Hill Valley, California, which is sort of just any town. And of course, there's a joke in the name, Hill Valley, and it's an oxymoron. But that's, I think, what works so well about it, that it's so simple and it's so real. Marty's so relatable. And I think every character, there's a character for everybody. No matter what kind of person you are, you can relate to somebody in that movie. And because it's so well done, and because it hasn't been redone, I think that's why we still care about it today. There's such a hunger, and as we went through this process, we found out, okay, wow, people love Back to the Future. I think the fact that there had never been a remake and never been a Back to the Future 4 20 years later allowed our film to sort of blossom, because this was the new content of Back to the Future that was coming out, and that wasn't in the original plan. That was something that we realized along the way, like, wow, two people, this is essentially Back to the Future 4, and as all the media hype around Back to the Future was going this year, one of the big things was that they said there will never be a Back to the Future 4, so this was the new content, and we were just lucky enough to be on the right end of it.
Oh, amazing. Amazing timing. It really struck a chord. One more question from my end, then I'll just ask the boys if they have anything else they would like to ask you. Like, really, I know you said that the intention was really to make a fan film, and then things kind of grew, and you got, all those great guys, especially Robert Zemeckis, who doesn't really interview very often, so that's really incredible. How did that evolve? How did it go from fan film to all of a sudden you're there interviewing Steven Spielberg and Robert Zemeckis and Bob Gale?
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely by far one of the biggest teachable moments of the entire process, which is that you got to be smart. The first thing is, if you're going to try to crowdfund any type of film, whether it's a narrative or documentary, I mean, make sure it's something that's going to interest people. Ask 10 friends if it's, if they want to see it, because otherwise you'll never get crowdfunding. And with Back to the Future, we picked one of the best topics, something that is so globally loved, and we've talked about this constantly. Back to the Future might be one of the most beloved films worldwide, period. Certainly Star Wars has a huge cult following, but not everyone's into alien wars. Back to the Future is so generic that it's just relatable in every corner of the globe, really. So when we started the process, we had reached out to Claudia Wells, who plays Jennifer, and Mayor Goldie Wilson, Don Folov, and we asked these guys to be involved, and they said yes, and we thought that was it. We thought we wouldn't get any other cast members. But we stayed strong. We kept the social media flowing throughout the entire production process, and we linked up with good people. Adam Goldberg, who's a creator of the Goldbergs. I don't know if you guys have it. And you guys have it, Hannah?
Yes.
So he came to us. He's like, I'm a huge Back to the Future fan. I love the 80s. I'd love to be a part of this production process with you. And we said, absolutely. It was actually before the Goldbergs was even on the air. I mean, that's kind of how long ago this process started. And so once he jumped on board, that opened doors for us. He shared the same agent as Zemeckis and was able to kind of get us in there. And then Bob Gale eventually made that final push. And that's the other thing. Bob Gale was on board with us from day one. And I think he sort of, he babysits the Back to the Future franchise. You know, if there's a new product or a new game or a new whatever, everything comes across his desk. And that's another, you know, solid teachable moment. You know, if you're going to make a documentary about something, try to go back to one of the original people that were in it and get their support. You know, Leah Thompson, who was very busy last year, she was on Dancing with the Stars, and her schedule was just crazy. It was hard to get an interview with her, and eventually, and this is we'd already had Michael J. Fox. You know, we called Bob Gale and said, Bob, you know, we're having trouble getting in touch with Leah. Within 1 hour of that phone call, we had an interview scheduled for 3 days later. So, you know, it just made it happen. Michael J. Fox was actually the hardest to get. You know, as limited a number of interviews as Zemeckis does. Michael J. Fox gets so many requests for Back to the Future things, and because he has Parkinson's, it's very difficult for him to do them. So we knew he'd be the hardest to get, but also knew that having his involvement would take our project by far to the next level. In the end, there was a Goldbergs episode about hoverboards where Adam on the show lies to his friends and tells them he rode a hoverboard or whatever. Because of Michael's relationship with Back to the Future, he needs to release this type of stuff when you show Back to the Future poster or anything like that. So Adam's office had a relationship with Michael's assistant because of the show. She loved Adam and gave us the interview, and that's how it happened. Steven Spielberg, you would think that it took every Hollywood insider phone call, whatever. It happened to be that a good friend of mine, his cousin is married to Steven Spielberg's sister. And that's it. He's married to Nancy. So my friend called his cousin and said, hey, you know, a friend of mine's doing this documentary, whatever. He got that message to Steven, and then we were put in touch with his, with Steven's assistant, and then made it happen. And the truth is, if we would have called Steven on day one, we wouldn't have gotten the interview even with the connection. It happened to be at that point, it was the end. He was the last interview we did. We already had Michael and Robert, and I mean, it was already rounded out. So when he learned about the project through his brother-in-law, I mean, there was credibility there. But, you know, it doesn't hurt to have friends. And I think the lesson, to put a bow on this answer, is that there has to be a methodology in terms of planning this stuff. I've gotten calls from other directors that are doing documentaries, and they want to know, hey, you know, doing a documentary about Star Wars. Someone called me about a Star Wars documentary, and they said, you know, having trouble getting cast and crew. I said, listen, you can't just call Harrison Ford and ask him to be in your documentary. I mean, you got to grow legs under the thing first. There's got to be a following, and once you get a little bit of following, you can go bigger and bigger and bigger. Find somebody who is on the crew, and once you have somebody who's on the crew, find an extra, and then kind of work from there. And that's how we did it.
Well, it's grassroots, really, from the get-go. Just an amazing accomplishment and a fantastic film. Is there any? Do you have any questions, Bruce? You were watching the film now. You have one last question. Do you have?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
So one thing I really noticed is with each interview, well, you obviously don't go through each person's interview like through the entire length. So you have one guy kind of tell one part of the story. You have all these interviews telling the same story, but you're progressing through the story, and obviously you're not asking one person a question, you end the interview, you go to another person, one question, and interview, and you go back to the other person. So there's this very fluid, progressive narrative through all these interviews. So how does that work? Yeah.
Right. So I mean, that's definitely all in the edit. Certainly, there are a couple different elements there. I think the first half of the film and the second half of the film are definitely different in terms of what you're talking about. In the first 35 minutes, where we tell the story of making a Back to the Future, we absolutely wanted to tell a single fluid story through everyone's eyes, which is what you just described. Whereas in the second half, we wanted to chapterize it more. Or, you know, here's this story, here's the next story, here's the next story. And we were still able to weave some of those connecting pieces in. We brought back some of the actors and crew into the second half of the film as well to kind of string the story along. we asked a lot of people the same questions. So when you're planning to do that type of narrative, make sure that people are telling the same story. I mean, if we asked 10 different people 10 different questions and had 100 different answers, it would be much more difficult to do that. And especially just interviewing techniques. You know, I conducted most of the interviews. You want to start off with some basic stuff and just make sure you have it down. Everyone was asked, so what was it like working on the set? Did you ever think that this would be a huge hit? Those types of questions we asked everybody, and you know, you want to take them back. It's difficult. Remember, a lot of people made a movie 30 years ago, and as many interviews that they've done, they probably don't remember everything all that well. So you know, you're jogging their memory. And then in terms of the edit, it's just a great storytelling technique. If three people, the best example is Eric Stoltz in our film. We asked everyone about Eric Stoltz getting fired. And then when you watch it back, you have 3 or 4 different perspectives on the story. So essentially, you tell the story from beginning to end, where certain people knew about it, certain people didn't know about it. So it was interesting where you have Bob Gale and Frank Price talking about how this thing wasn't working. And then into Zemeckis, who takes full responsibility about it, talking about it. And then we end with Christopher Lloyd, who, until it happened, didn't know about it because he was an actor. I mean, he wasn't being consulted on, on these types of decisions. So to hear him say, we were just at dinner one night, and then, that was also a unique, interesting perspective. So you just weave sort of the answers through. I'm not Morgan Spurlock or whatever. I wasn't going to be in this documentary. That was actually, I have a couple of cameos, but, that was never the intent. So you always ask people to answer in full sentences. So if I say, what's today? If they just said Monday, it would be totally out of context. But if they say today is Monday, or we're here on Monday, then you make sure you get a good, complete answer and that you're able to then do that and weave it. But I think it's just a process of story. I mean, it's just good storytelling to really, have enough content, enough material to weave the story. And we, in the edit process, when we were trying to get this thing down to 90 minutes, there were a lot of points where we would take out, we'd say, all right, let's take out this chunk because somebody's already saying it, or they're saying it differently, or it doesn't add to the story. You get the story without it. And that was a big part to pull those pieces out. And then you end up with a good fluid edit.
Well, thank you, and it's I'm a huge fan of your film and Back to the Future in general. So it's a great production overall. And thanks so much for taking the time to speak to these guys in Toronto. Really appreciate it. I know you're swamped with doing interviews and such. Just on a side, I have taken the liberty to record it for some guys who couldn't be here. Would you mind if I shared this conversation with other teachers? Because it's really a great reference point for especially production and media. So thanks very much, and best of luck, okay, on your journey. Keep up the great work.
So much.
Take care. Thank you guys. Take care. Bye bye.